Hi, welcome to XYChromies, Confidently Uncertain, a show where two Army vets turned renewable energy engineers discuss veteran issues, science, geopolitics, and everything in between. I'm your host, Pearson Guest, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, Richard Ellis. How's it going today, Richard?
Good, Pierce. Good to see you.
It's good to see you too. So we're picking right up. We just finished recording our last episode. We were talking, it was basically addiction part two, but I think we're really going to just call that cancer and how it is possibly tied to addiction, or addictions that cause cancer might just be kind of a surface level analysis. Um, so, in lieu of our good news segment, because we kind of just talked about one, I'm going to have Richard summarize what our last discussion was about, kind of, so we can set up me reading an excerpt from my book. So, Richard,
All
go ahead
right.
and
So what we
see
talked
what you can
about,
do.
great. All right. So what we talked about in our last session had to do with the role that stress plays in dysregulating long-term stress, the role it plays in dysregulating glucose metabolism. And glucose metabolism is implicated, based on a study that I read at the last episode, with suppressing the machinery in our cells that themselves repress tumor growth. And so what I was making was the not direct connection, but the process connection between what could be described as continuous and unabating allopathic load to the way that that affects our endocrine system, and the way that stress hormone and steroids like cortisol play a role changing how our bodies metabolize glucose, because glucose is what our cells use for energy. And the products of that metabolism are shown in when they're overly abundant to affect how our cells protect themselves from becoming cancerous.
Yeah.
And that has all these great implications into health and biology and neurology and the topic of post-traumatic stress and complex stress. So given that, I'll throw it back to you, Pierce.
Yeah, yeah. And just as a reminder, because we've thrown allopathic load around, that it's stress load, if we've said this before, but think of this as your load of stress. And allopathic load isn't a good or a bad thing necessarily. It really matters about the context of time. And so
Mm-hmm.
at time, intensity, and duration of allopathic load. So I think last time we talked, just for quick examples, um, having a high level of stress due to maybe food insecurity, that would be a long-term allopathic load where a child would be worried about when they're going to be able to eat next, and they have hunger
Yeah.
stress. That would be bad allopathic load. And then something that would look at as healthy would be like if you got to drive a race car or something for fun around a track, and it was something you paid or got to do for fun. Um,
Yeah.
you would have some stress load on you, but it would, after you were done, you would get out, you'd high five your friends and laugh and have a good time, talk about who was faster or whatever, and you would deregulate, which would be healthy allopathic load. Did I get those right?
You did. I'll change the word deregulate to attenuate or to downregulate.
Down
So
regulate.
it's
Okay.
it's about attenuating that system that's been activated for survival, the HPA axis that was activated for survival. But we can downregulate those systems and return to allopathic stasis through connection with people who are safe.
Yeah. So it's so funny you say attenuate, because a lot of what my book that I'm writing is about is attenuating your signal. If I imagine
Mm-hmm.
your whole life as a system is an amalgamation of a bunch of smaller sine waves or signals based on everything from you eat and to every decision you make, and um, any exogenous effect upon you, your overall signal. Um, you're trying to create a harmonious sine wave, and maybe that
Hmm.
sine wave is a balance between allopathic load and allopathic stasis, and a healthy
It
balance
is.
between them. So that rings true with the attenuation to the signal, and in much of what I think you and I talk about and have bonded over is our journey to attenuating our own signals and what we found so far along that journey, and like where we are um, on how that's going. And I think that's a lot of what we, in general, if there's this underlying theme to what we talk about with veterans issues, it's finding a way to solve this puzzle from our own perspectives using, the research and our interest in this topic, and the feedback that we've provided with each other to kind
Hmm.
of explore this general topic of figuring yourself out, making sure your signal isn't this static, distorted. And excuse me, I as a electrical engineer here, like I just can't help but think of signals and a frequency. And so when I'm imagining what most people's signals look like that are veterans who have done some form of enlisted service, if they have trauma, their signal might be distorted in some fashion and stuff. And so this is kind of um, that's the thesis, that underlying thesis of our conversation. Really, at the end of the day, is figuring that signal out.
And if I could reinforce the idea a little bit with a um, maybe a more approachable analogy, and that is uh, human beings are storytelling apes. We're storytelling hominids. What we do is we talk to each other and try to make sense of the world with stories. We might get that story totally wrong for many thousands of years, and then the 20th century comes along, and all of a and when we talk about that signal strength and that signal noise, I'd like to equate that to the idea that a story can be effective and work pretty well, but be high. It could be a high noise story. It could be a story that's not accurate at all. It works for a while, and then they'll we just never really catch on that it stopped working, and we keep using it, but it's actually making us miserable. And that is a great example of signal versus noise, and how that can happen even without us really noticing, without outside influence or outside subjective experience.
Um,
Signal and noise.
yeah, signal and noise. So yeah, I mean, this is a lot about what my book is getting at is signal processing and noise and um, constructive interference and destructive interference. What you're describing to me when I'm hearing of stories is I'm hearing of us using our different sensory, our perception, our, what would be considered like a bunch of operational amplifiers and filters, and to
Mm-hmm.
basically receive signals, visual signals
Mm-hmm.
through light particles and waves, um, and auditory signals, and we process that in this
Mm-hmm.
amazing thing that we've evolved to have. Um, and depending on how our signal is and what frequency we're operating at and what frequency the other one's operating, those a lot of those stories can resonate, right? We use a lot of, it's funny how the English language does have all these terms that talk about that we use interchangeably between harmonics basically, and then
Mm-hmm.
also just the English dialogue, like, hey, when I connect with someone, or something resonates with me, basically the vibe is right, right? All, vibrations, these are all terms that have to do with frequency and signal processing. So um, all of that is to say, I'm going to read an excerpt from my book that talks about one of my addictions,
Mm-hmm.
the trauma I think that bore it, and why it was an addictionship, what it
Mm-hmm.
represented, and I think it's something that lots of men suffer from, an addiction to video games. Um, I dare say this on the internet because it's a scary thing to talk about. Ill of video games. I don't have anything ill to say of video games themselves. They're awesome. I love to play them. Um, but there can be an unhealthy addiction to them. And so um, here we go. At this point, I'm not sure where to put this in the book or even if it belongs. I'm sitting here with the pressure in my gut that indicates that I'm experiencing stress and anxiety. It's a relic of my old traumas that was hidden for years and years by my constant cluster of addictions, which helped me suppress this feeling I now get for the last 2 years. Whenever I have deep, stressful thought, never used to experience it. Let me correct this. I think I never felt this prior due to the fact that I was doing so many substances, drugs, drinking, video games, anything to escape or disassociate or suppress the physical discomfort caused by my emotional state or my baseline. I must look more into this phenomenon because it's been a part of me ever since that fall prior to me quitting video games. I first experienced it my fall, the senior year, when an adjunct professor was a total ass clown and decided he was going to enact the hardest class possible on us because his HVAC class was his hardest class. The problem was he didn't have the technical practice of a PhD to teach the physics and math required to pass this class. Needless to say, it was quite a brutal class and probably the most stressful class I had ever experienced, as my degree and career were riding on me passing each class on time. I had quit tobacco and alcohol and not gaming yet, but the pressure was building. For the first time, I was feeling a pressure in my gut. It was a weird pressure because it wasn't painful, but there was some discomfort, like an old scar inflicted from a jagged blade had sliced me below my belly button, above my pubic hair region, along the entire front, where, like in a movie, you'd imagine my intestines come spilling out, like in Braveheart or something. Anyways, right there, I felt this pressure. It wasn't static, even, it would pulse and it would intensify throughout the day and weeks of that term until I talked to Richard and essentially stress dump my problems at his feet. This Richard, by the way, users, if you haven't pieced that together. Um, I don't remember, I don't even remember all we talked about, only it was definitely going over trauma. I didn't know this at the time, but Richard was seeing that I had trauma. It was most likely as clear as day to him. Um, and he tried to explain this to me, but I think he was still figuring out how best to describe the concepts he was absorbing and the thesis he was forming through his own self-exploration. As I now, know that he was battling cancer at this time too. Um, so he had mentioned I had PTSD, which, me being a veteran, immediately triggered a refutatory response because I had not been deployed. And in my head, you could only have PTSD from a deployment or like 9/11 or rape trauma, something severe and easy to see. After Richard and I's discussion, I remember going home and talking a lot with my wife the next couple weeks. We had only a couple of weeks left in the term, and I was able to make it through all of the classes, including the HVAC one, and make it to one of the most much needed Christmas breaks I had ever wanted. It was at this point that I was able to breathe and reflect on what had occurred to me the last 3 months, and especially on the conversations I had had with Richard, and then subsequently with my wife. During that reflection, my gut pressure started to ease, and I quit video games. I felt the pressure subside even more. I had long discussions with my wife, and suddenly I felt lighter than I had ever felt. It was sudden. I realized that the last 20 years of my life had been as though every day I would throw some invisible weight on my back and just keep moving forward. And after years and years of doing this, the weight was breaking me mentally and physically. Each vice, each pain ignored and suppressed for me years of what was crushing me slowly under my own weight. I was killing myself. This was how they did it. People who needed help and didn't know they even needed it. They had been blinded, tricked, fooled by their own brain into thinking they're doing just fine. You start comparing yourself to other broken people and saying, look, I'm doing better than them. Look how well I'm doing compared to them. Like, I'm the proud earner of a D average walking around pointing at F saying, look at, I did better than them and them and them. Look, I drink less than my mom and my dad. Look how much better I'm doing. And then you realize, shit, our brains have been broken. The wiring is messed up. It's been messed up probably from a long time ago by trauma. And perniciously, it doesn't even allow us to see how bad we really are or how damaged we truly are. One manifestation of how prolific the damage truly could grow to was my video game and the ecosystem of time required to get to this habit. See, after years and years of playing video games, and that being the most comforting vice of them all, I had created a system to get to video games. I would lie, procrastinate, rush, all in the service of my addiction to video games. I was a slave to video games. Sick, mad, depressed, unhappy, any of those, I needed video games. That would give me the comfort I needed. If I had a lot of hard homework in school, I needed to relax to play video games in between study sessions. If me and Sarah got into fights, I would angrily play video games there. If the homework was frustrating, the video games were there. Even as I slowly made adjustments in my life, one baby step at a time, I was always rushing it, and from me and Sarah from our social gatherings. Our adventures to bars and restaurants, I would have this anxiety about getting home to play a game or two. In the morning, I would wake up and would be rushing to take the dogs out and then to get to video games before I started to get ready for school. If I wasn't playing video games, I was planning all my chores and tasks Sarah had me do. Uh, they were our tasks and chores, but I felt like she was forcing to do them for me as I was a man baby at the time, to get to the video games. If I wasn't planning on playing video games, I was watching YouTube videos and streams on video games. I would consume video game content writ large and look at new video games coming out, new ways to feed the addiction. My wife would bring up the imbalances in my life, but I would viciously attack her or defend my habits with a myriad of excuses. It's like how I decompress, babe. I need to do this to relax. If I hadn't been doing my homework, she would probably annoyingly to give her to ask like my mom if I had finished my homework when I'd be gaming. She would have to ask. I wrote this like shit. Sorry, guys. Um, she would have to act like my mom, asking me if I had finished my homework. She would ask, you know. I would game late into the night. I would not take the dogs out on time. They would have accidents. I literally wanted to get back to the video games constantly. I justified my playing to myself. Many times I was just not enjoying the game I was playing anymore. I would tell myself I like playing games because this is how I stay connected to my friends, but the honest truth was many of the times I was playing alone against randoms and none of my friends were there to play with. I was playing games that I no longer really improved in and would argue that I was keeping my competitiveness alive. But all I was really doing was consuming time and space in my brain, my relationships, and my time left on this planet. The amount of space and time that the addiction had consumed in my life was gargantuan. I had not realized until I had quit. I'd quit tobacco previously, and I used to chew roughly a can of tobacco grizzly wintergreen a day. At $7 a can, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, it's roughly $2,600 a year, which isn't nothing. But the space and time of video games took was as if a levee protecting the ocean from entering a Grand Canyon had suddenly broke, and the water from the Pacific was somehow able to enter the Grand Canyon. I know this is a fictional scenario. I was filling to the brim. In the case of weight of video games, that allowed me to suppress a lot of myself and hide from my problems, hide from participating in the world. It had allowed me to escape the world, but I had come to love parts of the world more than the video games. And that realization didn't comport with my life. I had been building with my wife and kid. All right, I'm gonna have to take a break there, Richard. So, um, yeah, so that's where we're at so far. How does this sound familiar-wise to you? Can you relate to this at all?
So as you were reading it, I had about 19 different things flash into my mind that I thought I would uh, comment on. And what I what I like about the sort of the wind in the sails of that chapter that you've written is that it was where you begin to wake up, where you begin to have the why of this phase of your life was in the context of relationships. So there's this idea that is foreign to me, of course, because relationships are hazardous. Relationships are where you basically have no other recourse but just to be in trouble all the time, right? That's my foundational experience with relationships. But the emerging understanding that I'm getting from the trauma project that I've been working on is that it turns out relationships with safe people, with people who have your best interests in mind, are the ones who, one, can have the most influence over your making changes to yourself, and two, they're the people that they fill in the emptiness that an addiction or a relationship with a substance or a behavior can have. And one of the qualities about what you were talking about in regard to video gaming and substances and so forth was that these things work. They totally work. They totally get the job done. But they have a couple of problems that are hitched to them. And one is that they are short-term solutions for what is essentially a lifelong collection of problems or quirks. So they're short-term. And two, they're nearly always defined by their consequences. A relationship with video game playing and uh, hitting the tobacco can and adding alcohol into the mix, the consequences of those when you're by yourself are pretty minimal. I mean, as long as someone has a pipeline of, um, you know, let's call it being on the trust fund, the pipeline of finances and support, you can do those things indefinitely, never a problem. It's just what you do. But in the context of relationships, they always become problems. They always harm the other people that you care about because if for no other reason, they're just taking you away from the time you could be spending with.
Absolutely. That's absolutely true. All right, I'm
I
ready.
go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. Finish your thought.
Okay, so the other piece there, it's relational in nature, and that is that I'd like to reflect on that conversation that you started the chapter off with. You had gone to you and I had both gone to a industry advisory board meeting. Other faculty and other students there, and their staff members, people that were affiliated with the university uh, indirectly and so forth.
Yeah.
And we heard about some policy changes and some topics related to the curriculum for our degree program. And when it was over with, you you were sufficiently agitated by the topics that we covered that the the dysregulation in your heart and mind that could only be described as you talked about this really difficult class begin to uncover more because it's never the thing. It's never this. The class is just. It is such a surface layer veneer that it's I'm not going to tell you that at the time. Oh, this is nothing. Don't even worry
Yeah.
about it. That's not at all what you needed to hear.
Yeah.
You needed to hear what we talked about, which was to validate your experience as being it absolutely is hard. But really, the core of the matter, I knew then, and I have even more contact with its reality now, what was happening was the confluence of natural history and nervous system tone and biology that was all swirling around and become the social
Hold on.
aspect of what
Say
was
that
happening was
again,
becoming
Richard.
consequential for you.
Richard, your
And
mic cut
so
out for a second. Could
when
you
we
say
talk
that?
about this topic of addiction, or we talk about the topics of trauma or the topics of any other type of dysregulation, there's it's not, you can't isolate it. It's not in a vacuum. It is encumbered by so much more. So thanks for giving me a piece to say on that, but I'm eager to hear more of what you have.
Yeah, we had a little editing snafu. Sorry about that, everybody. Um, so picking back up before I started to get emotional, um, I had come to love parts of the world more than the video games and had that realization that it didn't comport with the life I had been building with my wife and kid. Slowly, without me even noticing, I had leveraged small parts of my shitty life for a better one, and the video games represented one of the big things stopping me from starting to really enjoy the world that was real. The feeling of the weight had been lifted. It was such an insane rush of emotion and experience. At the time, it felt like 1,000 invisible weights had been lifted, and in reality, it was just the beginning. Over the next couple months and that year, I experienced some of the wildest dreams I'd ever experienced. Vivid memories would arise, clear as the day. They would sometimes be prompted on their own, and many times they were elicited by observations of my son. So that was the end of it. I just got emotional at the end, actually, I realized. But that's the end of the excerpt that I had. Um, so yeah, that was my feeling at the time when I quit video games. It was not just it was a heightened. I wonder what my HPA axis would have been at that moment or something. I don't know. I felt like I was releasing a lot of oxytocin at the time because I was really connecting with my wife and kid over the Christmas break. Um, which would make sense if so much was, sometimes I think about all of these hormones as like, I know they're being released at the time and that they have an effect and they're supposed to wear off or whatever, but I almost think of it as like the laws of energy, like the conservation of energy. And it's like
Mm-hmm.
video games, the reason I keep calling these addictions addictionships is because I had a relationship with the video game. And like you've alluded to before, this was serving a purpose. When I was a
Yeah.
child, I grew up in a house where I didn't know what type of father I would have that night. And I didn't know what our financial situation would be that week, if money was going to be an issue, and if I was going to be put to work for existing under the household,
Mm-hmm.
and if I was going to be punished severely for what most parents would look at as minor infractions, if not an infraction at all. Um, and I was punished in a world this where no foundation could be built because I was always on sand and the ground was always shifting beneath me. Even when we reached teenage years, when my dad's construction company started to do well, he was so poor at managing money, it was feast or famine. But we had to project that we were doing well to
Mm-hmm.
the small town we lived in. So suddenly I was a poor rich kid that to the outside world, and my life wasn't even comporting with the reality of what my life was. And my dad was also very um, charismatic. He was one of the most charismatic people out there. Like honey came out of his mouth. Every one of my friends loved my dad. They thought he was the coolest guy ever. He allowed them to cuss around them and would sneak beers to all of them. He was the cool dad. Um, to me, he was terrifying. But when you tell your friends that and they see what your dad is like to everybody else, it was a complete different reality.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a teacher's pet. I would find outlets for getting rewards, and I found a system of rewards at school. But school was very boring, and I found a better system of rewards when I discovered video games, right? And there were rules that you could follow,
Hmm.
and you'd get rewarded for doing well in the video game. And yeah, it was a perfect mechanism um, to feed someone who wanted to escape the reality of their their home life. And as you alluded to in the episode before about your cancer, my mom had cancer from 10 till I was 16. So suddenly the only whole adult in the house was my dad. Um, and my mom was absent due to, in mind and body and spirit, essentially, because she was on death's door, as you experienced as well, multiple
Hmm.
times. As 6 years is a long time to do chemo and radiation and stuff, and it does, yeah, it's a race between will the it kill the cancer before it kills the host, and that's essentially the game that's played there. So the video game addiction makes a lot of sense for my life. It represented structure and stability at the time, and for a time, it served its purpose. But as I got older, it affected every facet of my life. I was the kind of person who I didn't like to renege on my obligations. So I would still try, when I'd go to work, I'd work hard.
Hmm.
But video games could make me not want to go to work certain days. So I would not be a good worker by that standard, right? I'd go to work most days. Uh, Even in the army, there would be things where, like, I was in the Special Forces training program. I needed to be going to the gym and doing extracurricular studying to learn to become a good soldier, especially being an 18 X-ray. Like, looking at it now, I was a dumb 25-year-old who thought the army would fix all of my addictions and problems, when instead I was just m- constantly diving into them head first. The army was something I would do during the day or at night, depending on what it was. I was in the Q course for a long time. They love to punish X-rays there. So it's getting triggered every week constantly. I would just go and escape to video games on the weekends, or booze, drinking, go out, and then
Hmm.
play video games hungover the whole next day or something like that. Whatever, it didn't matter. Um, Everything was in service of getting through reality to get to my illusion worlds. Um, and that grew and grew and grew. And because I picked the army and made terrible decisions as I went through my army life, just, getting married when I shouldn't have, and, just really going off the deep end. Um, I wasn't a bad soldier. I showed up on time. Dressed the way you were supposed to. I did all of the things you were supposed to do, but outside of the the work hours, I just was a complete disaster and came out of the army just completely mentally broken and freeform. So, yeah, until I met Sarah, I really didn't have that social excuse to have anything take my time in reality up. Like, I didn't have reasons to be in reality until I met her,
Hmm.
and suddenly there was a reason to be in reality. That didn't mean I quit video games. I dug in. It was almost as if my addictionship realized it was threatened, by this external threat, which was, my future wife. And my wife was an external threat to an addiction, because they both were the vie for my time. And through the power of her being more integral into my life as she stuck around, and then once I had the kid, then it started to be multiple social pressures that were eroding my that addiction away. So yeah, it was a I, it's an interesting addiction. I know some people are addicted to video games and they don't have that deep traumatic tie to it. It could just be ADHD as well. So, take what I say with a grain of salt, I know. Um, but in my experience, a lot of people who are addicted to video games are most likely teachers' pets. They'll have these similar traits. They want to impress adults, um, and they don't um, they there was instability in the house and the rules were changing for them. So people who could have this trauma are not necessarily poor people at all. It could be people with high functioning parents, like so imagine two lawyer parents or two PhD doctorates who are very busy with their career oriented parents who aren't around to raise the children. So these could be middle class, upper middle class children, um, who would not get much sympathy from the world because of where they grew up in the status. But these people will be multi-degree having children. Usually they take a long time to grow up and go in the real world, especially because they find comfort in the school system because they're high achievers. A lot of these people could be high achievers. Um, and these are just from my noticing at school, people who probably had a lot of this trauma of the unstable household and just parents not being there, even if they're, seemingly good people and professionals, that creates a lot of instability in the household. Especially those parents might yell or be mad when they come home and things have I mean, imagine they come home, there's things wrong with the house because the kids are being kids, but they weren't there to lay out the rules, so they're mad at themselves, but then they're mad at the kid for doing the thing, and the kid didn't know it
Mhm.
was a rule until now they're being yelled at. And this could be that household where every day the parents are not there to parent, and therefore the rules are always changing because they're upset at the kids just being kids. This could create that instability that would make you seek solace in video games, seek the solace of good feedback from teachers and coaches and anybody who will give you um, tell you the rules of what the game is, which in school is just, hey, study, do your homework well, and participate in class, be a teacher's pet, basically. And you'll get rewarded with good grades and praise from the teachers because teachers love those students. Why wouldn't they? It's somebody who's actively trying to learn. It's such a fun game to play. Um, and so yeah, those are my thoughts about this addiction and what I've just noticed from my own life and from observations at school from people I think who have similar addictions and have experienced a similar background.
Well, before I uh, perform a diagnosis, which I'm unqualified to do,
I'm ready.
I'll base what I had to say off of this quote from Bessel van der Kolk. Trauma is when we are not seen and not known. And so it is what you described about your formative experience is uh, 9 different recipes of essentially being unseen and unknown in your family of origin. And that is to say that you have scarce narcissistic supplies coming from your paternal side, and you have scarce connection supplies coming from your maternal side. She wasn't able to connect with you or be available to you in the way that you described where she was in treatment. One of the things I wanted to mention, but we just didn't quite get to it. The details are so many, with so many details about the cancer treatment, depending on what cocktail of materials that she was on. I asked my oncologist one week why it was that every Saturday I felt like just unbridled hell. I said, I just want to hide in a dark place and make everyone go away. I can't stand being around anyone. And she said, oh, that's the withdrawal from the steroids. We give you steroids at the beginning of the crashing off.
Oh,
I said,
shit.
thanks for letting me know.
Oh my
You're
God.
giving me you're giving me roid rage.
Oh my God. That
It's
is incredible.
impossible to sustain a connected and attuned relationship with another person under the influence of steroids or the withdrawal from steroids.
Yeah. You'd have to be an angel to be able, yeah.
Yeah, it would have to be impossible for you to need them in the first place, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
But
Well,
under the influence of steroids, your brain cannot connect with human beings.
yeah, and I amend the angel statement because angels did become demons. So, I mean, yeah, and that might be the concoction that would take is just, yeah. No,
So, when you're describing that formative past and that history that was living in you, certainly up to the moment when you and I were talking about that stressful fall term, it's clearly been there the whole time. It's clearly been under the surface, just waiting for you to reestablish contact with it. And it's never fun. It's really painful to do so because what you're encountering is every time your developmental self was essentially left out to the elements. And in the model of attachment and authenticity that Gabor Mate talks about, that attachment was being distressed each one of those times. Yet that lack of connection was existentially terrifying. And I know it sounds like an exaggeration, but it's not how our nervous systems experience it.
especially not for
And
children. I mean, like,
no,
because I have the two little, I have my two little test subjects right here at 4 and 2, and
yeah,
you know, if you've ever just raised your voice around a 2-year-old, um, even if it's not directed at him, like you're like yelling at the dog for shitting on the floor or whatever, like
right.
I'm not a perfect human, all right? The dog shitting on the floor will cause some yelling from me, but my son, what will stop you from yelling, is your son looking at you horrified. They're afraid,
Yeah.
and I've just traumatized them. They don't know what's happening. They just saw that, somebody they love who they have, like scare them. And, God, you just that on a micro scale, like that lives in me. The rest of, if I see that face, it lives in me the rest of the week. I think about
Hmm.
it. And so the problem with these reflections is you start to realize how little introspection my own and possibly probably your parents had, because I'm like, wait, you know, that what's the old adage? Oh, you'll understand when you're a parent. And
Hmm.
it's like, frankly, I don't. I understand less, right? Like I understand
Yeah.
actually less of what you guys were doing when you were doing it, and it's like it's actually is so much worse than I thought when I think about it. And but I wanted to say something about it's easy to get trapped in like this doom. But one thing I will say is neuroplasticity is incredible. And through connection and social connection, it
Hmm.
has pulled me from the depths of those
Hmm.
feelings. I found new connections. The old adage of it's not the family you came from, it's the family you create or whatever, something like that, where you get
Hmm.
to create your own social circle. And this is one of the best ways we heal. It is like the pathway to healing. You don't attenuate your signal without other people's signal there to help get you there, and yours was one of those signals. My wife's was obviously a huge driving signal, and then my kids were a huge signal too. I mean, that's what is kind of the light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to this stuff is like my brain doesn't function the way it did 2, 3 years ago. Before we had that
Hmm.
trauma dump moment, my I'm not the same person that I was before. And when I address that pain that you're talking about. And it is painful. And it's not just one time, it's multiple times. It comes in
Right.
waves. It's because your brain is a very tricky. little creature there. It goes, okay, you can handle this much pain, okay, and then it goes, all right, maybe you're mentally ready to handle some more pain, or maybe you're not, but you're kind of ready. And so this is because your brain does this, and that's what it did with me. You experience it multiple times, but it's not over the same issue, because if you're if you're going through this process the right way, and I say right, this is just the right way for me, that it worked for me.
Mhm.
I was engaging my prefrontal cortex, and I am thinking through this problem. And I always found, and I mentioned this in the book, I would feel this pressure back in my gut, when I was stressed out about something. And I knew it was a core stress, something that was that was bugging me, that would cause physiological distress in me, like something like that. I always found I relieved it when I would talk with my wife and get that social feedback that I needed to talk my ideas out of my own head, get smart feedback from someone who I trusted that would regurgitate the information back to me, maybe in a way that I didn't understand, or she'll,
Mhm.
give me insight. And this has always been one of the methods I've deregulated or de-stressed, I guess, or whatever you would call it. Um, and I found a new one in writing too, which, yeah, go figure. That one's been a really cool um, little exploration there. But yeah, I'm gonna stop talking because I feel like I'm rambling now.
There's a couple of things I would like to mention. I'm not, by the way, for the audience's purposes, I'm not psychoanalyzing Pearson. That's not my job. I'm not professional. But what I've done is enough work talks about these things. I want to share with you some of the insight that I have from my own work. So it's not psychoanalysis. What it is I want to give everyone the idea of the tools that I.
Yeah,
So one of them is this. It's a it's this theory around how our brain segments itself into different parts, and this is called structural dissociation. So I got really interested in dissociation about a year ago when I was. So I may have mentioned on our program that I take ballroom dancing courses, and I had been doing it for 2 years at that point. And I went to one of the adjudicated events where I'd be judged on skills so far. So there's a little pressure there. But I got out on the dance floor. I danced with a couple of different instructors that I was familiar with, and I was just going through the motions. And I'd come off the dance floor, and I would, I was actually connecting with another man that is one of the dancers there at my studio. And I said, I don't have any narrative memory of what just happened. He and I were standing off to the side and sort of like protecting ourselves in that way that people who have common um, features to their their brains, their nervous systems will do. We sort of were
yeah.
finding a protective state, detached from the crowd and all the noise and clamor,
We see
and
this in
we
the
were,
middle school against the
yeah,
walls, right?
yeah, totally. We
Just a bunch of, yeah, middle schoolers. You see them literally go find their protective little herd yeah.
totally. Now, I like the idea that my friend is a man of about 6'9". So it's fun to talk to somebody who's this gigantic person who also, toils under these features that you and I talk about, because his formative experience was one of those annihilating experiences that I described by being unseen and unknown. So I came off the dance floor. I have no narrative memory of, which meant that while I was out there doing the things, I was structurally dissociated. What that means in the context of the theory is that there is a part that we can describe as going on with business as usual. That part gets up every morning, it combs its hair and takes a shower, or maybe flip that around, takes a shower and combs its hair. It prepares lunch, it goes to work, it goes through the motions. That part just lives. It doesn't live a whole enriching life. It just lives well enough so that it can keep feeding itself. And then the other part is all of the sub-fractured pieces that represent the animal survival strategies and the um, parts that are they've been in, their individuality or authenticity was annihilated by a caregiver at some point or someone that was important to us, but they're all the little fractured pieces. And so as I'm describing this feature to you and to the audience, here that you described going on with life as usual by getting up every morning, going to formation, saluting the commissioned officers, going to the chow, and as soon as you got done, your fractured parts took over and tried to deal with their non-integration with each other. And the video game addiction and relationship, as you're combining them together as a addiction, is like it it's textbook according to this theory.
Mm-hmm.
Because it what it does is it doesn't integrate the parts, but what it does is it salves the injuries of each of those parts. It provides a soothing bath, if you will, to each time your developmental self was harmed in a household that couldn't see you as existentially valuable. It only saw your worth wherever it could be applied in a transaction. And I know that sounds like I'm projecting onto you because that's definitely my experience. But it turns out these types of formative experiences, they can be different in a few ways, but really the outcomes are similar for all.
Oh,
So that's one thing I wanted to mention is the structural dissociation concept. And if that helps anybody, I really wanted to get that out there. Go ahead. You had
yeah.
something to say.
Oh, I was gonna just say, yeah, I mean, my dad complimented me a lot to the public, like to fa friends, family, anybody he could. I was, a mascot to be bragged
Mm-hmm.
about, talented and, so smart was always one of the things, straight A student, blah, blah, blah. That had to start changing after eighth grade, yeah, once I started going to high school and, stopped, my grades. Actually, no, through sophomore year, I think I still was getting straight A's because I still
Mm-hmm.
cared. I cared to about sophomore year. I think that was when I was, I think it was actually my mom who had crushed part of my spirit on this one, but I don't hold her too much to it because she was dying of cancer at the time. So, um, she still was, yes, yeah,
Right.
at 16. But I was, I wanted to graduate early. Like I wanted to get out of the house. I didn't know that was why I wanted to get out of the house. I
Mm-hmm.
just wanted to get out of the town. I wanted to graduate early. I could graduate early. I was a straight A student who had been in AP classes my whole time, and but my mom was afraid. She was like, oh, she was afraid about a 16-year-old away from household, and about me being around a bunch of older people and all of those other things. And I think she was afraid of losing me because she was in a vulnerable
Mm-hmm.
state and, early and stuff. And I don't know if she was mentally prepared to handle that. So I understand why she said
No.
no. Um, but I think
Yeah.
that probably killed a lot of ambition, and I really got into video games at 16. I think that probably it was a crucial age for me. I think, and I see with a lot of young men, I think 14 to 16 is just, it's all the times are crucial, by the way. When I say this, they're all crucial. It's not like 14 and
Yeah.
16 just happen. It just seems like that's the last time for a bit that you're going to be able to get in there to this kid and change them on what is going to be an inflection point. um
Those are highly
yeah,
vulnerable years. And they're
yeah,
vulnerable years for a couple of different reasons. It's you the first part of my state statement or idea to comment on what you're saying is that, first of all, none of us go through puberty at the same time, but by 14, things have started to move.
Yeah.
And by 14, they've been on the move for a while, but they're really noticeable. And what's taking place is a restructuring of your brain that is caused by the endocrine system shift.
Hmm.
There's a there's a book by someone who had a pituitary tumor. I'm forgetting all the facts about this. Maybe we'll put it in the show notes later if I'll
Okay.
come up with it. It's like the book's
Let's
maybe called Man-Made or something like that's the title.
we'll have this be the last
He
story for and we'll wrap on this. But yeah.
he talks about um, growing into adulthood but never having gone through puberty.
Hmm.
And if you compare his experience with everyone else who did, we're in a storm. By 14, the storm is really on its way, and by 16, we've been living in it for 2 years. And the part of the reason why you feel so strongly that is at least one of the really important, age ranges is just because whatever our ideas about ourselves were before 14, those ideas have been thrown into a blender. And the most robust and secure household is about all that we have between us and completely losing contact. What will now shape our early adult life.
Yeah.
And much
And
like yourself, the wind was in my sails to get out of that house, get out of that community, and get away from that culture.
yeah. I was an incredibly I should be studied for my naivety and my ignorance because I truly thought my living situation was amazing. I would brag about it to
Mm-hmm.
my wife, like, oh yeah, I grew up in a hard household, but I came out all right. Look at me now. And my wife's like, at the
Every
time, she's
time, right?
like, you're falling apart, you asshole. Like, right before my eyes. She's, like the whole time, I think she was always like, oh my God, I didn't. It would be like, I was like an onion that as you unpeel, it's like, it's worse every peel. It's like, oh yeah, he's complex like an onion. It's just like, oh, it's a whole bunch of like, oh shit, really? And I did that while we dated, seemingly this
Yeah.
gorgeous Persian angel, like, and this just guy, Fat Pierce, I called him, he's Fat Pierce. I was, 30 pounds heavier than I am now. Just deteriorating, around her. And she kind of, I mean, thank God she saw a spark. She was like, well, I think really it comes down to boredom. She was like really bored and needed a project. And she was like, well, she had to level up to take this one on.
There are those of us in your friend group who believe her to be unsighted. She just doesn't have vision.
Yeah, yeah. She would say it's astigmatism. Yeah, yeah. So I think that's a really good place to end it on. This is, I guess it would just be a whole show about addiction. I swear we'll talk about other things, people, but this is there are a lot of layers of this onion to unpack, and God, I had a lot of addictionships, so yeah, you got introduced to a couple of them. The gaming one though today. So
Well, next time we convene, I want to maybe make a teaser here that if we wanted to make this a 2-hour show, just this one, I'd introduce the concept of the polyvagal theory one more time. So I'd like to introduce it later on a different program because the polyvagal theory gets at some of the most interesting details about what we talk about with regard to our complex traumatic lives
I love it.
and how it influences later with the choices that we make.
I'm really excited to talk about this and continue this discussion. So thanks so much, Richard, for all your insight, and yeah, look forward to talking to you again.
Right on, buddy. It's good to talk with you.
Take care.
Signing off.